Number 1. The Crenshaw site, Skull-And-Mandible trophies. A brush moves across red Arkansas soil on the bank of the Red River, and a curve of pale bone appears. It is the top of a human skull. A few inches away there is another, and then a third, and then a jawbone with no skull attached to it at all. Keep clearing, and the floor of the pit resolves into a lattice of human heads. This is the Crenshaw site, in Miller County, in the far southwestern corner of the state, and the count here is not 2 or 3. By one accounting, the ceremonial deposits at Crenshaw held roughly 300 human skulls and more than 1,500 separate lower jaws. Crenshaw was a Caddo mound and cemetery complex, occupied between about 700 and 1400 of the Common Era. It sat on the Red River, a corridor of trade and movement, and it appears to have been a gathering place, a ceremonial center that drew people in. The skulls and the jaws were not lying where their bodies fell. They had been separated from the rest of the skeleton, the heads and the jaws curated apart from the arms and legs and ribs, and then arranged with deliberate care. This is not the debris of a battlefield. It is a decision, repeated hundreds of times. For decades, the explanation seemed obvious. The American Southeast had a long tradition of taking war trophies, and a pile of enemy heads fit that pattern. The dead of Crenshaw were read as defeated outsiders, brought back and stacked as proof of victory. Then the science arrived and turned the story inside out. John Samuelson, working at the University of Arkansas, together with colleagues including Jamie Lockhart, ran isotope analysis on the remains. Strontium locked into the teeth records the geology of the place where a person grew up. If these were foreign enemies, their chemistry should point somewhere else. Here is where the ground stops confirming the easy answer and starts arguing with it. The isotopic signatures did not point to distant enemies. They pointed local. The people whose heads were kept and arranged at Crenshaw appear to have come from the Red River region itself. Ancient DNA work was pursued to test how they were related to one another. The war trophy reading suddenly looked wrong, and a stranger possibility opened up. The community may have been keeping and honoring the heads of its own dead. So the theories now sit in tension. The mainstream southeastern view still allows for trophy taking. A second reading sees ancestor veneration, the ritual curation of a community's own people. A third, more speculative, imagines a head cult, a belief system centered on the skull as a seat of power. The remains sit within the southeastern ceremonial complex alongside antler objects and other ritual material, and Mound C at the site is tied to this mortuary activity. Today, the Caddo Nation, based in Oklahoma, are the descendants, and the remains are handled through consultation under federal law. The disturbing part of Crenshaw is not that a massacre happened, it is that no simple massacre explains it. A society over centuries systematically removed hundreds of heads and over 1,000 jaws and arranged them with intent, and the best science we have suggests they were doing it to their own. We are looking at the physical residue of a belief we can no longer read, and the people who could explain it have been silent for 600 years. Number 2. The Key, Marco Muck Idols. It is 1896 on Marco Island on the Gulf Coast of Florida, and a man reaches into black swamp muck and lifts out a human face. The face is carved from wood. It still carries its paint, black and white and gray. For a few hours it is perfect. Then, as it dries in the open air, the wood begins to curl. It cracks. It shrinks. By the end, it is powder. This is the excavation led by Frank Hamilton Cushing of the Smithsonian, and it is one of the great discoveries and one of the great losses in American archaeology, and it is the same event. The site was a waterlogged pond associated with the Calusa, the maritime chiefdom that ruled southwest Florida. The Calusa did not farm. They built a complex, powerful society on fish, shellfish, and the resources of the estuaries, and they raised enormous mounds of shell. The muck at Key Marco was starved of oxygen, and that is the whole story of why it mattered. In that airless mud, wood and cordage and pigment survived, the perishable things that vanish everywhere else in North America. When Cushing's crew opened it, they were looking at objects that had no business still existing. The most famous survivor is small, only about 6 inches tall. It is the Key Marco cat, a kneeling figure that is half human and half feline, carved somewhere in the window between 500 and 1500 of the Common Era. Around it came painted masks and figureheads of deer and sea turtle and pelican and atlatels and netting and ceremonial tablets. Many of them still wore their original colors when they came out of the mud, and then, one after another, most of them destroyed themselves in the light. What saved the memory of these objects was not conservation. It was a painter. Will Sawyer made watercolors on site, and early photographs were taken, and for a great many of the key Marco pieces, those images are the only record that survives of what they looked like whole. The objects themselves are gone. This is why key Marco became a permanent lesson. Every conservator who deals with waterlogged wood learns the cautionary tale of the site, where masterpieces were pulled from the muck without any way to stabilize them, and paid for the discovery by disintegrating. The theories about the objects themselves are less contested and more haunting. Most researchers read the masks and figureheads as ceremonial and religious, the equipment of ritual. Some see in them a theatrical or dance tradition, faces meant to be worn and moved. A more speculative reading treats them as shamanic effigies, tools for crossing between worlds. What survives sits in the Smithsonian, the Penn Museum, and the Marco Island Historical Society, and in recent years, the cat itself has come home to Marco Island for exhibition. The stakes here are quiet and enormous. For one afternoon in 1896, an entire perishable art world surfaced, a world of painted wood and living color from a society that left almost nothing else behind. And then it erased itself in front of the people who found it. Everything we lost that day was already 2,000 years into surviving. It reminds us that most of America's deep past was made of wood and fiber and paint, and that almost all of it is simply gone, unseen and unrecorded, dissolved back into the ground. Number 3. The Mammoth Cave Mummies. 2,000 years ago, deep in the dark under Kentucky, a man is working by torchlight. He is prying at the cave wall for minerals, and above him a massive rock the size of a small truck begins to move. He has no time. The boulder, estimated at around 6 tons, comes down and pins him where he stands. He is not found for 2,000 years. When he is found, in 1935, on a shelf now called Mummy Ledge, his body is still there, still pinned, still holding the posture of the last second of his life. Mammoth Cave is the longest cave system known on Earth, with more than 400 miles of mapped passages. Long before it was a tourist attraction, it was a mine. Native American miners went underground here for gypsum, mirability, and epsomite, working by the light of bundled cane torches. The cave did something to their dead that almost no American ground does. Its interior is dry and stable, and that steady microclimate desiccated bodies naturally, turning them into mummies without any embalming at all. The cave preserved them the way a sealed jar preserves what is put inside it. The man crushed on the ledge became known as Lost John. He was radiocarbon, dated to roughly 2,000 years old, and he was found with the tools of his trade, cane torches, and gathering implements, so that the moment of his death reads like a frozen photograph of prehistoric labor. He was not the first mummy pulled from these passages. Decades earlier, in the early 1800s, a desiccated body called Fawn Hoof was taken from nearby Short Cave, and then exhibited, handled, and passed among collectors until most of the scientific value was gone. The mining itself can be dated because the miners left their torches behind. Charcoal from burnt cane scattered through the passages shows that this underground work went on across a long span, from roughly 4,000 to 2,000 years ago. The desiccated bodies preserved skin and hair and even the contents of the gut, which let researchers study what these people ate and what parasites they carried. Preserved human waste from the cave studied directly has added to that picture of diet and health in remarkable detail. For a long time, these dead were treated as attractions. This was the showman era of cave tourism, and the mummies were given nicknames: Lost John, Little Alice, and put on display for paying visitors. Modern ethics closed that chapter. Lost John was eventually taken off exhibit and curated and reburied out of respect, under the same federal framework that governs Native American remains today, with consultation with affiliated tribes. The National Park Service, which manages the cave, oversees this care now. What the miners were after remains partly open. The gypsum they pried loose may have been a pigment, or a medicine, or a material with ceremonial meaning, or a good for trade, and the readings differ. But the image that stays with you is not the mineral. It is the man on the ledge. He went to work in the deepest dark that people of his time could reach, and the rock caught him. And instead of decaying, he simply stayed, holding the exact shape of an ordinary bad day for 2,000 years. He is, in a real sense, the oldest workplace accident in America, preserved in full. Number 4. The Awatovi Massacre Room. On a winter night around the year 1700, on Antelope Mesa in northeastern Arizona, warriors moved through a sleeping town. According to Hopi tradition, they trapped the men of the village inside the kivas, the underground ceremonial chambers, and they set the town on fire. By morning, Awatovi is burning, its men are dead, and it will never be lived in again. What archaeologists later find at the destruction layer is ash, collapsed structure, and human bone, the physical floor of that night. Awatovi was not a small place. It was one of the largest ancestral Hopi towns, with hundreds of rooms and multiple kivas, a real center on the mesa. In the 17th century, the Spanish built a Franciscan mission here, San Bernardo, after about 1629, pressing Catholicism onto the community. Then, in 1680, came the Pueblo Revolt, when the Pueblo world rose up, expelled and killed missionaries, and threw out the Spanish across the region. Awatovi took part in that rejection like the others. The rupture came afterward. In the years around 1700, some residents of Awatovi allowed Catholic missionaries to return. To other Hopi villages, this was a betrayal, a reopening of a wound the whole people had bled to close. Tradition holds that warriors from other villages, remembered as Oribe and Walpi, made the decision to destroy Awatovi, and they carried it out in a single night attack. This is the detail that sets the site apart from almost every other massacre in this list. It was not done by a foreign army. It was one part of a people annihilating another part of itself. In the 1930s, Harvard's Peabody Museum sponsored major excavations at Awatovi, led by J.O. Brew. Later, the physical anthropologist Christy Turner analyzed human skeletal material connected to the event, including remains from a locality called Palaka Wash. Here, the ground gets contested, and this is where the calm account has to break. Turner reported cut marks, burning, and breakage on the bones, and across the Southwest, he interpreted such patterns as evidence of cannibalism. That interpretation set off one of the fiercest and longest debates in American archaeology, and it is far from settled. So the readings diverge sharply. The mainstream historical view sees an Intri-Hopi purge, a violent internal cleansing tied to apostasy and to accusations of sorcery. The archaeological reading advanced by Turner and others adds the processing of bodies to that picture. And Hopi oral tradition frames the destruction in its own terms as the removal of a corruption, a matter the descendant community still treats with great sensitivity. The excavated material is curated at the Peabody, handled today under federal consultation. The horror of Awatovi is not spectacle, it is intimacy. Colonial religious pressure had forced its way into these communities, and the fracture it opened ran straight through the Hopi people themselves. When the breaking point came, the violence did not arrive from outside the world of the mesas. It came from the next village over. A town of hundreds of rooms lived in for generations was emptied and burned in a night by neighbors who shared its language and its gods. And the land it stood on was left silent on purpose. Number 5. The Hopewell Severed Skull Deposits. Excavators cut into a low green mound in Ross County, Ohio, and lift back the sod, and inside they find human skulls laid in order. Beside them are lower jaws, some of them polished, some cut and drilled and shaped, resting on a bed of sheet mica and copper. These are not full burials. They are heads and jaws, selected, worked, and kept. This is the Hopewell Mound Group, the site that gives an entire ancient culture its name, and the neatness of the arrangement is part of what unsettles. The Hopewell tradition flourished across the Ohio and Illinois valleys from roughly 100 before the Common Era to about 500 of the Common Era. They are famous first for engineering. They raise monumental geometric earthworks, circles and squares and octagons of enormous size, some aligned to the cycles of the sun and moon, as at the Newark earthworks. Modeling of these sites shows standardized units of measurement carried across the landscape. In 2023, the Hopewell ceremonial earthworks were inscribed as a World Heritage Site, a recognition of just how sophisticated this building was. They were also connected across a continent. The Hopewell Exchange Network pulled obsidian from Yellowstone, copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachians, and shark teeth and marine shell from the Gulf Coast, all of it converging on these Ohio centers. Their burials hold that wealth: mica cutouts, copper falcons, effigy pipes carved as animals. And among that refinement sits the treatment of human heads. Isolated skulls and worked mandibles appear across Hopewell and related sites, evidence of a curated, ongoing relationship with the bone of the dead. Warren K. Moorhead dug the Hopewell-type site in the 1890s and recovered spectacular caches, and later, work refined the record. Part of the Hopewell mortuary program was cremation, carried out in specialized basins inside charnel houses. Against that background, the skulls that were not cremated stand out. Certain individuals were singled out for different treatment, their heads kept separate, sometimes reshaped into objects. A jaw that has been cut and drilled is no longer only a jaw. It has become something to be held, worn, or displayed. The theories run along a familiar edge. One reading treats the skulls as war trophies taken from enemies. Another sees venerated ancestors, the honored dead kept close. A third reads them as sacred relics, objects of power in their own right, where the line between person and artifact has dissolved. The Hopewell collapse around 500 of the Common Era only deepens the mystery because we do not know why the whole system wound down. Climate shift, social change, and the fraying of those long exchange networks are all on the table. Here is the weight of it. This was one of the most artistically and mathematically refined societies of ancient North America. A people who could lay out a lunar alignment across acres of earth and trace copper into the shape of a hawk. And the same people kept human heads and jaws, curated and displayed, inside their mounds. The serene grass exteriors that visitors walk today are the roof of a mortuary world, and inside that world, the dead were not simply buried. They were sorted, and some of them were kept. Number 6. The Horn Shelter Double Burial. 11,000 years ago, beneath a rock overhang on the Brazos River in central Texas, 2 people are laid into the earth together. They are set on a bed of turtle shells. Around them are placed the talons of hawks, the claws of a badger, the bones of a coyote or a dog, and beads of shell. Then the floor of the shelter is closed over them. When archaeologists open that grave in the 1960s and 70s, they are looking at one of the oldest burials on the entire continent, and one of the strangest. The place is Horn Shelter No. 2 in Bosque County, and the burial belongs to the late Paleo-Indian period, the world of the first Americans in the centuries just after the last ice age. The grave held an adult and a child. The adult is interpreted as a man in his late 30s or 40s. The child was around 11 or 12 years old. They were interred side by side, together, beneath the shelter floor. And a double burial of this age is almost unheard of in North America. Most of what we know about these earliest people we know from their tools and their trash. Here instead we have their dead, laid out with care. It is the grave goods that turn the burial from moving to uncanny. The turtle shells may have formed a bed or a covering. The talons of birds of prey and the claws of a badger are not food scraps. They are regalia, chosen and placed. Because of them, the adult is often read as a person of special standing, sometimes described as a possible shaman, someone whose role in life was marked in death by the parts of powerful predators. The Paleo-Indian toolkit found at the shelter, the points and blades, anchors the burial in its culture, and careful reading of the layers fixes it firmly at the transition out of the Ice Age. The interpretations here are less about violence and more about meaning. The mainstream reading is a ritual burial of a special individual marked by that raptor and animal regalia. A second, simpler reading focuses on the human bond, a parent and a child, or 2 people close enough to be laid down together. A third leans into the belief system, treating the talons and shells as the equipment of a specific role we can no longer name. Comparisons are drawn with other early graves, with Anzac in Montana and Arch Lake in New Mexico, as researchers try to build a picture of how the first Americans treated their dead. And that is exactly why this one belongs on a list of disturbing finds, even though it is gentle. Almost everything else we recover from mass death and violence and accident. This is the opposite. 2 people at the very dawn of human life on this continent were buried together, wrapped in the shells of turtles and the claws of hunters, by mourners who believed something specific about what those objects would do for them. We are reading a funeral 11,000 years deep, and we can see the tenderness in it clearly, and we still cannot hear a single word of what it meant. Number 7. Proctor's Ledge. In 2016, a small cart rolls slowly across a rocky ledge behind an ordinary neighborhood in Salem, Massachusetts. It carries ground-penetrating radar. The people pushing it are not looking for treasure. They're confirming the exact patch of ground where, in the year 1692, 19 people were hanged for witchcraft. For more than 3 centuries, no one had known precisely where it was. A team called the Gallows Hill Project fixed it here, at a place called Proctor's Ledge, at the base of the larger hill. The Salem witch trials produced 20 executions, 19 people were hanged, and one man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death under a pile of stones, the only execution of its kind in American history. The victims were not witches. They were neighbors caught in a storm of accusation, spectral evidence, and Puritan fear. And the panic ran for roughly a year, from the first hanging in June to the last that autumn. The first to die was Bridget Bishop. Among the others were Rebecca Nurse, Sarah Good, the former minister, George Burroughs, and John Proctor, whose name the ledge itself now carries. For all the fame of the trials, the killing ground had been lost. Local tradition pointed only vaguely at Gallows Hill. The confirmation took real work. The team, including the historian Emerson Baker and others, built on earlier research by Sidney Purley from 1921 and combined ground-penetrating radar, aerial imagery, historical documents, and eyewitness references, including a line from 1692 by a woman named Rebecca Eames who described seeing the executions. Together, those threads converged on the ledge. This is archaeology done with records and instruments rather than shovels because there was nothing here to dig up. That absence is its own small horror. No bodies were buried at Proctor's Ledge. The families of the hanged are believed to have come in secret and taken some of their remains away for private burial, unwilling to leave their dead on the execution ground. Over the centuries, the spot was partly built over. Houses went up nearby. A drugstore stood close to where the gallows had been. People lived their whole lives beside it without knowing what the ledge was. The trials themselves remain a field of debate, and the theories about the afflictions that started it all still compete. The mainstream historical reading points to social and economic tension, scapegoating, and mass hysteria in a divided community. A medical line has proposed ergot poisoning from tainted grain, or an outbreak of encephalitis, as a physical trigger for the fits. A third view emphasizes outright fraud, accusations made on purpose, what is not in doubt is the injustice, and the memorial dedicated at Proctor's Ledge in 2017 inscribes the victims' names in stone. The reason this find disturbs is the ordinariness of the place. We imagine notorious executions happening somewhere set apart, marked, remembered. Instead, the exact ground where 19 innocent people were hanged sat for 300 years behind a quiet Salem neighborhood, paved and built over and forgotten until a radar cart rolled across it and gave the ground its name back. The horror was never far away in the woods. It was in the middle of town, under everyone's feet. Number 8. The Etowah Mounds Elite Mortuary. Inside a mound in northwestern Georgia, a shovel exposes a body wrapped in copper, and then, beside it, 2 faces of white stone staring up out of the dark earth. They are a pair of marble statues, a seated man and a seated woman, carved to represent revered ancestors or gods buried in the mortuary heart of a lost American capital. This is Etowah on the Etowah River near Cartersville, and the mound that holds these things, Mound C, was a temple to the dead. Etowah was a Mississippian center, occupied mainly between about 1000 and 1550 of the Common Era, with its peak power in the century or so after 1250. It was a real seat of authority. Its largest mound, Mound A, rises about 63 feet, one of the tallest earthen pyramids in the southeast, all of it built by hand, one basket of soil at a time. The society that raised it was stratified, ruled by an elite, and steeped in the imagery of the southeastern ceremonial complex, the falcon, the hand and eye, the birdman warrior repeated on copper and shell. Mound C, excavated in the 20th century, notably by Louis Larson in the 1950s and 60s, gave up the wealth of that elite. There were embossed copper plates showing winged birdman figures. There were shell gorgets and ceremonial stone axes. And there were the marble effigy statues, among the finest sculptures of pre-Columbian Eastern North America. High-status bodies were laid to rest here covered in copper ornaments, marked in death as the rulers they had been. For a while, this was a place where god-kings were buried like gods. Then the ground records something violent, and this is where the clean picture of a sacred city has to bend. The evidence at Etowah suggests the chiefdom was attacked and its mortuary temple desecrated, most likely in the late 14th century. The site had been fortified with a defensive ditch and a palisade set with bastions, a landscape braced for war. The marble statues themselves were found buried, and one reading is that they were hidden or ritually interred during exactly that crisis, sacred objects pushed into the earth to keep them from enemy hands as the order that made them collapsed. The theories about that fall diverge. The mainstream reading is warfare and dynastic overthrow, a rival power sacking the center and defiling its holy places. A second view emphasizes ritual closure, the deliberate hiding and burying of sacred things by Etowah's own people as their world came apart. A more speculative reading points to internal collapse, the chiefdom coming undone from within. Etowah's power flickered afterward, and by the time Hernando de Soto passed through the region in 1540, near the end of the Mississippian world, the great age of the Mounds was already fading. Today the statues sit in a museum on the site, and the Muskogee are among the descendants. The disturbing power of Etowah is the arc it captures. Here was a fully American dynasty with sacred kings wrapped in beaten copper, marble gods watching over a temple mound, an entire theology of power written in falcon wings. And it ended in a sack. The tombs were opened by enemies, the holy places desecrated, the god statues shoved into the dirt for safekeeping by people who knew their world was falling. Under the calm green mounds of a Georgia state park lies the record of a kingdom that was buried alive. Number 9. The Donner Party Winter Camp. It is the winter of 1846, high in the Sierra Nevada, and beside a small fire a family is boiling fragments of bone. They are breaking the bones first, then boiling them, to draw out the marrow and the last of the grease, because there is nothing else left. This is the camp of the Donner Party, trapped by early and merciless snow near what is now Truckee, California, and the hearth they are crouched over will be excavated more than a century and a half later, and it will still hold the evidence of what they did to survive. The Donner Party were emigrants bound for California in 1846. They took a poorly scouted shortcut, the Hastings Cutoff, which cost them precious weeks crossing the Wasatch and the Salt Desert, and they reached the mountains too late. The snow closed the passes. Of roughly 87 people, about 40 died over that winter. They sheltered in two main places at Truckee Lake, now called Donner Lake, and a few miles away at Alder Creek, where the Donner families themselves camped. Survivor accounts and the diary of Patrick Breen recorded the slow arithmetic of starvation, and they spoke, carefully and often unwillingly, of cannibalism. In the 2000s, archaeologists including Julie Shablitsky and Kelly Dixon excavated the Alder Creek hearth site, and the ground gave up thousands of bone fragments. The bones had been burned, boiled, and fractured, processed as completely as bone can be processed. Analysis identified cattle, deer, horse, and dog, the animals the party had killed and then rendered down to nothing. This is where the story becomes genuinely contested, and the honest account has to say so. Whether definitive human bone was identified at Alder Creek remains debated, because the burning and boiling and smashing had destroyed the very features needed to tell one species from another. But notice what the ambiguity does not erase. Even setting the human question aside, the hearth records people boiling splinters of bone to extract every possible calorie, which is itself a portrait of starvation so extreme it strips a person down to pure survival. The documentary record is less ambiguous than the Alder Creek bone. The accounts tied to the Murphy cabin at Donner Lake describe cannibalism directly, and the survivors, who spent the rest of their lives shadowed by it, tended to deny or minimize what had happened. The rescue parties, the desperate group that called itself the Forlorn Hope, and the relief expeditions that followed reached the camps across the winter and spring of 1847. The theories, then, are really about evidence and memory. The documentary reading, supported by testimony and the Murphy cabin accounts, accepts survival cannibalism as fact. The archaeological reading at Alder Creek holds a careful line about what that particular hearth can and cannot prove. And a third thread runs through both, the shame and denial of the survivors, which shaped every account they left behind. The camps are memorialized now at Donner Memorial State Park, where a monument stands on a base as tall as the snow was deep. What makes the Donner Party unbearable is how ordinary they were. These were not soldiers or fanatics. They were families with children and diaries and plans for California, and one bad shortcut and one early winter reduced them to breaking apart their own dead and boiling the bones. The archaeology turned a frontier legend into stratified physical fact, a hearth full of shattered bone under the Sierra snow, and it stands as the darkest single lesson of the westward trails. Number 10. The Fort William Henry Mass Grave. In August of 1757, at the southern end of Lake George in New York, a British garrison surrenders and marches out of its fort, and the killing begins along the column. 2 centuries later, their bones come up out of the ground with the cut marks still on them. Fort William Henry is where a legendary massacre and hard skeletal evidence meet, and the meeting is not comfortable. What Cooper turned into a novel, the excavators turned back into trauma written on bone. The fort was built in 1755 during the French and Indian War, a British strongpoint controlling the corridor between the Hudson Valley and Lake Champlain toward Canada. In 1757, the French general Montcalm besieged it and forced its surrender. What happened next, as the British and their dependents left under the terms of that surrender, became the Massacre of 1757, when French allied native warriors attacked the departing column. James Fenimore Cooper made it the centerpiece of The Last of the Mohicans in 1826, and film after film has dramatized it since, until the legend nearly swallowed the history. Then, in the 1950s, reconstruction of the fort turned into excavation, and the ground answered back. Diggers uncovered a cemetery associated with the garrison, and the human remains told a blunt story. Skeletons showed violent trauma, blade wounds, cut marks, and evidence consistent with scalping. They also showed the other killer of frontier forts. Smallpox had been present at Fort William Henry, and the crowded, unsanitary conditions of the siege bred disease as surely as the fighting spilled blood. Physical anthropologists studied the bones to reconstruct the health, the diet, and the injuries of 18th century soldiers, and around them lay musket balls, buttons, and buckles. Here, the honest account has to flag a live dispute because the number itself is contested. The true death toll of the 1757 massacre has been argued over by historians for a long time. The figure is almost certainly far lower than the sweeping slaughter Cooper described, but it is not zero, and it is not small, with scores of people killed. The bones do not settle the count on their own, but they do settle the fact of violence. A scalping cut on a skull is not literature. It is direct osteological testimony, a specific injury inflicted on a specific person, preserved for the excavator to read. The interpretations sit along that seam between myth and material. The mainstream reading is a real massacre of the surrendered column by French allied warriors. A second thread emphasizes disease, the smallpox and squalor that killed quietly alongside the blades. And a third is the dramatization itself, the way a famous novel inflated and reshaped the event in the public memory until the archaeology had to pull it back toward fact. For years, some of the excavated remains were displayed at the reconstructed fort's museum. And in 1993, they were reburied in a formal ceremony, an ethical correction to an older habit of exhibiting the dead. Fort William Henry closes this list because it shows both of the ways the American ground keeps its horrors. There is the fast violence, the ambush on the column, the blade and the scalping knife, legible in cut marks 2.5 centuries old. And there is the slow violence, disease moving through a packed and filthy fort, killing without a wound. A novel made this place immortal, but it was the bones, marked and buried and finally lifted, that told the truth of it. And the truth was worse and stranger and more human than the story. Lay these 10 sites beside one another and a pattern surfaces. The American ground keeps its dead in radically different ways, and it keeps them for radically different reasons. At Crenshaw and among the Hopewell Mounds, human heads were curated, sorted, and displayed. At Awatovi and Fort William Henry, whole communities were cut down in an afternoon. At Horn Shelter, 2 people were laid down together with the claws of predators in what can only be called tenderness. The same continent holds all of it, sometimes only a few states apart. A second thread runs through every one of these finds, and it is worth naming plainly. The word disturbing is often a story we tell before the data lands. Crenshaw looked like a heap of enemy trophies until the isotopes said the dead were local. Awatovi's bones carry cut marks whose meaning is still fought over. The Alder Creek hearth is full of shattered bone that resists being sorted into species at all. Again and again, the first reading is violence, and the second reading, the one that arrives with the science, is stranger, quieter, and harder to hold. Notice, too, how much of this survives by accident. Ordinary ground destroys the past. It takes flesh and wood and paint and gives back only stone and bone. What preserved these sites were exceptions. The airless muck of Key Marco held painted wood. The dry microclimate of Mammoth cave desiccated a miner into a mummy. The Sierra snow sealed a hearth. The ash of a burned mesa town fixed a single night in place. Every one of these discoveries is a window that only opened because the normal rules of decay were suspended, which means that for every Key Marco we found, countless others simply dissolved. There is an ethical thread as well, and it has changed how this work is done. Lost John was taken off exhibit and reburied. The Fort William Henry remains were reburied in 1993. The Caddo, the Hopi, the Muskogee, and other descendant nations are consulted about the remains of their ancestors under federal law. The era when the dead were nicknamed and put behind glass for paying visitors is closing. And the people who study these sites now carry a responsibility that the earlier showmen never felt. And these are not distant, sealed-off places. They are visitable. Mammoth Cave is a national park. Etowah and Salem and Fort William Henry are historic sites and memorials. Donner Memorial State Park stands where the snow closed the pass. The disturbing things archaeologists found in the United States are not hidden in some foreign wilderness. They are under the ordinary American ground, behind the neighborhood, beneath the tourist trail, a few feet down from where people stand and read the signs. Set against all of that certainty is everything the ground still refuses to tell us. We do not know, and may never know, why the people of Crenshaw kept and arranged the heads of their own dead. We cannot say for certain whether the shattered bone at Alder Creek is human. We cannot fix the real death toll at Fort William Henry. The very conditions that preserve these sites, the fire, the muck, the boiling, the centuries, are the same conditions that erase the evidence we would need to close the case. That is the deeper unease once the shock of skulls and mummies and massacres wears off. The most disturbing thing here is not the violence, it is how much intention we still cannot read. These were deliberate acts, funerals and purges and offerings, carried out by people who understood exactly what they meant, and we are left holding the physical residue of decisions whose reasons died with them. And they lie so close together. On the same continent, in the same soil, tenderness and atrocity rest inches apart. A child buried with hawk talons, and a town burned with its men inside it, and the ground keeps them both with the same patient silence. If the deep past still has questions for you, there's another investigation waiting on your screen right now, and subscribing keeps them coming.